Lot number 10 in our first Scheherazade Foundation auction is a story entitled Very Slippy Weather, and along with it comes a truly exceptional and exquisite hand-etched illustration by the master illustrator of Georgian times, Gilray, and it's framed and one of a very limited number that were produced by Gilray in the very early part of the 19th century. It is exceptional and the story is enlivening.
Dear Mr. Gilray, as you are currently away in the country, I wish to tell you about an amusing little incident which took place this morning outside the shop. An event which, in my estimation, may provide sufficient material for a new caricature, not least because my shop, your caricatures, and our esteemed mutual friend, the Reverend Sneyd, were all principal players in the comedy that unfolded. I use the word comedy advisedly, for the Reverend was very much the butt of the joke, and while his physical injuries are on the mend, those to his pride will take time to heal. This unusually cold weather we've been experiencing was the prime mover of the drama. Thanks to the recent legacy from his aunt, the details of which I have no need to bore you with, not least because Sneyd himself has done such a good job of that, the Reverend decided to purchase a new pair of boots, his old ones having become rather worn and leaky. Inspired by this new acquisition, he subsequently decided to spend more money on fixing his thermometer, which, as you will also be aware, he was convinced had become faulty, refusing to reflect the true coldness of the time of year. Why he needs a scientific confirmation of what everyone can feel in their bones is beyond me, but I digress. So this morning, armed with the thermometer and suitably attired in his shiny new boots, he set forth for St. James's Street, where at number 19, Mr. Jones the watchmaker is famed for his qualities as a repairer of all things mechanical. Thus it was that the Reverend found himself walking past number 27, my shop and your home, and it was here that fate intervened. The slope of St. James's Street is not insignificant, and it would appear that the Reverend had made every effort to carry his beloved thermometer with all due care and attention, for as he has repeated to me more than once since, the mercury therein is the most precious commodity, and the reason why such objects command the high prices that they do. A thermometer without its mercury is like a man without his soul, an empty shell without purpose in God's creation. One might be forgiven for imagining that the events I am about to relate, while possibly providing you with another caricature, will, in the Reverend's case, be transformed into a most lengthy and enlightening Sunday morning sermon. As he approached my establishment, the Reverend noticed that the usual crowd was gathered outside the window, gazing with amused intent at your wares displayed within each pane of glass as per our custom. Labouring with his thermometer, and less sure underfoot than he might have wished to be, the Reverend asked members of the public to clear a way for him that he might get past. Some of them were known to him, indeed were quite intimate acquaintances, but as though speaking to the deaf, his words failed to have the desired effect, for the spectators of your work were so fixated on the caricatures on display that it was as if they were unconcerned, indeed unaware of all the events around them. So drawing on his many years as a man of the cloth, and thereby accustomed to addressing large congregations, the Reverend raised his voice, and once again appealed for passage through the crowd. Yet again he was paid no heed. Around this time, the Reverend Sneyd was beginning to entertain considerable doubts about the fine pair of boots, of which he had availed himself only the day before. While his old ones had indeed been in a sorry state, yet their very roughness had made them more suited to the current icy and very slippery weather. By contrast, the new footwear gracing his lower limbs was as soft and smooth as the skin of a newborn babe. With some alarm, he began to understand that the combination of the ice underfoot, the downward slope, and the difficulty of his movement through the crowd were about to place his precious cargo in grave danger, and so with all the dignity he could muster, he made a momentous decision. It was at that very moment that I, alerted by the sound of his voice, looked out from the upstairs window, from which vantage point I was able to witness the event. Needless to say, it all took place in much less time than it takes to tell, indeed in the blinking of an eye, but as you yourself commented, there are such moments short in mere temporal duration, which, for reasons which cannot always be explained, nonetheless endure for a much greater time thereafter in the imagination, and I believe that this was just such a one. As I watched, the Reverend made a tentative step forwards, as though through the power of movement alone he might convince the crowd, who still had no awareness of his presence, so enthralled were they with your work, that they might give way. Seeing that this failed to have the desired outcome, he then launched himself forwards, beating the paving stones with his cane as one who threshes wheat. At first this appeared to bring dividends, as he made some clear progress, taking 2, 3, even 4 strides forwards, while the crowd, still unseeing, parted way for him, as though by divine intervention. At this moment one might be forgiven for imagining the Reverend's mind being populated with passages from Exodus, referring to the Red Sea and its ability to part on command. Yet, if this was the case, he was about to be undone. Earlier that morning, long before dawn, Sarah the housemaid had mopped the entrance to the shop and thrown out the wastewater onto the street. Yet this being an unusually cold time of year, she had tossed the water not from the far side of the pavement, but from the very doorstep, for fear of catching cold herself, with the result that not a small amount of water had fallen on the paving stones. It being dark at the time, no notice was made of it, and indeed the whole day might well have progressed without her act going detected in any way, but for the arrival several hours later of the Reverend Sneyd, with his thermometer and wearing his new boots. So it was that, fired by his unexpected and quite miraculous sudden progress through the previously unmovable crowd, the Reverend strode swiftly and confidently across this particularly icy patch, which was where his spectacular fall from grace occurred. As though whipped from beneath him, his elegantly booted feet now slipped uncontrollably and flew high into the air, while his buttocks, more bony and less cushioned than one might desire in such a circumstance, made hard, dare one say, crushing contact with the frozen paving stones beneath. Thus cast down in such an unforgiving fashion, his hat now fell off, taking with it his wig and exposing his hairless pate to the elements. Furthermore, his braces burst their buttons, a handful of gold sovereigns, one assumes to pay Mr. Jones for his thermometer repairing expertise, fell from his pocket, and his snuff-box was ejected from his jacket, casting its contents into the filth of the cobblestones. The look of pain and shock on our dear friend's face at this moment would have to be seen to be believed, and the coldness, for which no scientific proof is needed, was clearly registered in his bones, as acutely as it was for the rest of us mortals. But 2 most noteworthy details are worth describing. Firstly, that the Reverend made not one sound, not one cry of anguish in any moment of this, his lips remaining firmly and resolutely closed. Secondly, his beloved thermometer suffered no damage throughout, being thrust by his hand in perpendicular motion upwards, as though by some animal instinct of protection, where it remained aloof and removed from the decline and fall below, in which it had played no small part. As for the poor Reverend, within a few moments he had managed to pick himself up, replace wig and hat to their rightful place, rebutton his braces, and return the scattered coins to his pocket. The snuff and its box were left where they fell. Then, after a brief and vigorous rubbing of his affected parts, made to proceed with his journey, far more gingerly this time, but clearly grateful that the thermometer had suffered far less damage than himself. Yet there is a third detail of the event that I wish to describe. At no instant in any of this, not before or during or after, was the attention of any of the bystanders distracted from your caricatures displayed in the shop window. An elderly churchman losing his dignity in such a comic manner would ordinarily cause great hilarity amongst onlookers, and indeed become the stuff of many a repeated anecdote, told and retold, even by those who had not witnessed the spectacle themselves. Yet in this instance, no one, not one person except myself, saw the event, despite its happening right next to the crowd, because they were so distracted and amused at that very moment by your work. Caricatures which, in numerous cases, show comic and satirical events not unlike the one which was taking place behind their backs. Not even the clinking of coins or their golden shine as they spilled from the reverend's pockets was enough to engage their attention. My dear Mr. Gilray, do you see what you have done? You have portrayed the world so well and in such a palatable form, making it a colourful place of wit and laughter, that people no longer see the humdrum everyday variety. They can only see your version of it. And if an event does not appear in one of your illustrations, then it does not exist for them at all, not even the kind of event which might otherwise appear in your caricatures. Which inevitably, I believe, raises an interesting question. What is real, the event, or the caricature of it, or a caricature? And here we get to the rub of the matter, and perhaps the subject of a new work, showing the event taking place in the vicinity of people who are unaware of its passing because they are too absorbed in looking at caricatures depicting very similar events. The truly curious thing is that in turn these people, potential witnesses, yet entirely ignorant of what has happened beneath their very noses, will only become aware of the event because one day it will appear in the form of a caricature in the same window which distracted them from perceiving its passing in the first place, and all the while, behind them, further events may still be happening. I could go on, but shall stop here. Once one turns one's mind to such possibilities, the logical twists can become dizzying and possibly fruitless, but I suspect by now you see what I mean. Perhaps this cold snap has befuddled my own brain, and you do not find this as curious and noteworthy as I. But on your return, if you so desire, we will talk about it further, and I can provide you with more details. I will end this letter here. It is late, and I must to bed. I wish you Godspeed. Affectionately, Mrs. Humphrey.